Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Alan Daly and Kara Finnigan to present.
Hi. Alan, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, good. So let's see. Look, we're going to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, because I know we're broadcasting all over the place. So it's a real pleasure to have everybody here and to be a part of this. So thanks to the REL Midwest. My name's Alan Daly. I'm at the University of California, San Diego, and I'm pleased to be joined by my fabulous partner, who I'll let introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Kara Finnigan, and I'm at the University of Rochester.
So Kara and I have the privilege of being the opening band for this great concert you're about to hear. And we're going to talk a little bit about our work, which has to do with the acquisition, use, and diffusion of evidence in educational systems. So if you didn't sign up to hear about this evidence bit, then this is your chance. So the first slide that we have here, we're waiting for control to come over. There we go. Okay, excellent. So the first slide that you see is sort of just what Kara and I do, and most people finish up their papers, they pop a bottle of champagne or do something like this. Kara and I create word clouds over the stuff that we publish. And this is from a recent paper to show you that we're really focused on this idea about evidence. And while we're focused on this idea about evidence, we're also thinking about things around networks and data and how information and knowledge moves in the system. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. And so the next slide. The next slide is how we think about our work. So you've heard a little bit about the area we play, but the most important thing about our work, and I think the work that you're going to hear about across all the panelists today, is this idea about making the hippos dance. So when we talk about that, what we mean is that oftentimes, particularly in research, we're creating these big ideas which are really important, but often they kind of lumber about or they swim around in the water and they don't really make their way to practice or to policy. So the real trick here is how do we take those ideas and how do we help them dance to move into practice and to policy? And at the heart of this work is this idea about the intersections between research and the movement of evidence as it goes into practice and policy.
And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the work that this is based upon that we're talking about today. Alan and I have been working together for about 10 years now. We've been studying several systems across the country, 4 districts in particular. And when we gather data, we do it at both the school level and the whole district level. So that involves central office and school teachers and leaders. We've ended up having about 1,000 people involved across our survey and our interviews in these different sites, and we're very grateful for the foundation support we've had from WT Grant and the Spencer Foundation. Next slide. We've used both case study data and survey analysis in this work, and that involves in each district we look at both high-performing and low-performing schools to try to see any patterns of differences in the networks that we're looking at, and also the entire system. Mostly we think about this as leaders within the system, so thinking about principals and central office staff as a system of leaders. And we've done in the case study work, we have interviews and observations and document review that comprise that work. And then in the survey work, next slide, we have both the different levels I mentioned in terms of school and leadership and central office, as well as we have both our network data and we have other data that we gather that helps us with analysis around the organizational learning, climate, and culture, as well as research evidence and use. So over time, we've had data in all of these districts, multiple time points, both qualitative and quantitative, and that allows us both to look at the universe of people in those systems, but also to do a matched analysis of people who remain in the system over a 4-year period. And we have high response rates, so that allows us to have high quality data to share with you.
And so we have, as you can see, we have quite an enormous amount of data that would take a heck of a long time to go through and talk about. We're just going to take a small slice and privilege some of what we've been really finding in our work that's really important, and that's this idea about relationships. And so what we've been noticing around evidence in our work is that it moves through people. And this is sort of the classic picture of that famous game Telephone, where somebody whispers something into somebody else's ear, and then it goes through this whole chain of interactions and networks, and finally the message becomes really different when it gets to the very end. So the idea is that as evidence moves through people, it gets changed, modified, filtered in some ways, and that process, that social process, is a really important one for us to pay attention to. And the way that we do that primarily in this particular work, which we're privileging today, is through this idea called social networks. And social networks are very interested in the sets of interactions that happen between and among people. And so Kara and I create these really interesting looking maps to try to understand the social structure. So in this particular example, you see a couple of key actors, Hamlet and Claudius. This happens to be a friendship network. And each one of the dots represents a main player in the system, and the lines represent the connections between them. And when you see nodes, these little dots that are bigger, that means that they have more resources that are flowing to them. So now let's take a look at some actual data from a school. And so Kara will show us some data we've collected recently.
Yes, as Alan suggests, Hamlet wasn't in our study, but here is a school that was included. And now this is data that you're looking at, that the yellow or the black nodes, the black just means we were missing some attribute information, but those were teachers, and the orange nodes are administrators within a school. And what you see here is that was a question about who do you turn to for evidence you use in your practice. And you can see on this slide that most of the people, this is the direction of the arrows, are turning to that one central node that's orange. And there are some other connections across, but mostly this would be considered a very centralized network. You also see some dots on the side. If we could go back for a sec. The dots on the side are a really important thing. That's not a mistake. Those are people who are in this school who are not connected to anyone in the network. So they don't turn to anyone for research they use in their practice, and nobody turns to them, or research evidence, I should say. Also, one thing that's important, one last thing about this slide, is that the principal ended up leaving in the following year. And so you can see when something is so centralized that it disrupts the entire network. And so there just wouldn't be this movement of evidence in this school anymore once this central person left. Now the next slide. This is another set of data from a district level set of data in terms of the leadership, what we call the leadership network, the principals and central office. So here you see the blue nodes are principals, the red are central office, and again you have people on the side who aren't connected at all around evidence use. And one of the other pieces that we have done in our work is look at the lowest performing schools in the system. So the square, the blue squares, are the principals at the low performing schools. And this was actually really important for us, understanding that even when, so you don't see a lot of connectedness, particularly across these two groups, the principal and central office leaders, but especially within the group of low performing schools, they are less likely to be connected into the evidence that's flowing throughout this district. And so that would be something that would be a concern in the district in terms of how ideas and practices flow to the principals in those schools. Next.
So the other part to our work is, so you could sort of think that's the quantity of relationships, right? The sets of interactions that are happening between people. But the other part of our work is really interested in the quality of these relationships. And one of the things that we find in our work consistently is the role of trust and high quality relationships in moving evidence. So for folks that have these stronger trust ties, which we'll circle around to a little bit later, they're able to share evidence at a much deeper level. And so we can also think about this work over time. So this particular map that you're looking at, you've got two networks that are shown at time point 1 and time point 2. And so it's the same color coordination that Kara was sharing before, with the red being central office actors, the blue being principals. And you could see this is about affective ties or trust ties. And you can see this district, we collected data at time point 1. You can see essentially there's sort of the system is broken into two. You've got the sort of red group of central office actors interacting. You've got the blue group of principals kind of interacting, and they're really separated. You can also see you've got a number of folks off to the side that are not engaging around these affective ties at all. Now, what's interesting to note here is that one of these nodes right here, this red one right here, that connects the two of them, that individual retired. And so when we look at the next year's data, we really see the affective ties being really broken apart in this particular district. And remember, these affective trust ties are really important for the movement of evidence. We can also think about other kinds of ties that exist in districts, and this is a different district. Here, the same coloration is exactly the same. The red nodes represent central office actors. The blue nodes represent the principals. You see on the left, time point 1, on the right, time point 2. And bear in mind, in the work that Kara and I do, we are committed to sharing this data back into the systems so that they're aware of the sets of relationships that exist and don't exist. Let's look at a different kind of relationship now. Kara will take us through.
So as bridges are important geographically, they are also important in thinking about networks and the relationships people have, connectedness that they have. And so in a lot of places you find that there are clusters of people who do connect, but they might not connect to each other. So the clusters are sort of each isolated. So I'm going to show you a network map where we found this to be the case. This is in one of our districts, and this is set up a little differently because in this district, school leaders were grouped together into these clusters themselves, and so these are, the colored versions are the principal clusters, and then the black are central office. And the reason why you see a black triangle is because there was an assistant superintendent who was meant to be the go-between between the principals and central office in these groups. So in terms of thinking about brokers or bridges, they're the kind of people who connect the disconnected groups, and they're sized, in this map, they're sized by playing that role. So if you are someone who tends to connect people who are disconnected, you have a larger triangle in this picture. And the you have a larger node, and mostly this maps with triangles in some of the clusters, but it doesn't in other clusters. And the reason why this is important is because the district actually thought that these leaders were playing that bridging role. And so you can see where sometimes the formal positions people play do not map onto the informal relationships that exist. Next slide. We also had, this sort of came up without us actually intending to look for it, but what we noticed over time, as you try to trace patterns around relationships over time, we found that there was a great deal of churn in these systems, people moving in and out of the schools and of central office. And so this is a map that helps to demonstrate the problems with unstable systems. In this map, again, the nodes are sized by this bridging or brokering role that people play, connecting otherwise unconnected groups. And in this case, the key players are the ones who really hold the system together because they play this role more than anyone else. And the blue color nodes right now are the ones who left the system. So in the importance of this is that most of these key players, all but one, are someone who played such a big brokering role and then left the system. So you can see again how instability causes fragmentation and disrupts the networks around evidence use.
Right.
And so just in summary, the relationships matter to evidence uptake in terms of the connections individuals have with each other. And as I was suggesting, these strong, stable internal connections are critical. But we've also found, and this is in our most recent data that we're working on right now, that it's not just the individual connections around trust, but the climate of trust that supports the movement and uptake of evidence that's important. And finally, that the movement of evidence is highly reliant on these brokers who connect these otherwise unconnected groups.
And so for all of you that were wise enough to join us today, here are some sort of large-scale, high-level takeaways from our work over the past 5 or 6 years. So we've got to help systems move beyond compliance to developing more capacity building at different levels of the system. we've got to really think about what are the policies and practices that incentivize collaborative work across different levels of the system to weave together the network to make it even stronger. We also have to be thoughtful around building the human capital around evidence interpretation and how we make sense out of it. This is also related to that idea about churn, is that while we're losing human capital knowledge, we're also losing social capital, or the important set of those relationships. And then really what's really important here at the heart of this is this idea about social capital to really build the norms of reciprocal exchanges, because those ties between and among us are going to be really important, and that's where the heart of trust is built. And so with that, we thank you and thank our fellow collaborators and the foundations for all their support, and we'll turn it back over to our colleagues.